Good morning in Montana, at University of Montana, Brit. You are a specialist science communicator, a performer, a scientist, and a teacher, making difficult concepts from science simple for ordinary people like me. And today we want to ask you around biodiversity, ecosystems, and species, and making this simple for everybody looking at this show.
Yeah, biodiversity in terms of buzzwords is huge right now, and there's a reason, because there's a lot happening to biodiversity. But what do we even mean when we say biodiversity is in trouble or biodiversity is declining? Well, I love language, and I love to start with the word itself. So biodiversity, bio meaning life, and then diversity or diverse is coming from that same root meaning, diverge or to split. And so biodiversity is looking at all those amazing splits in the tree of life to see what is now here. And there are different levels of biodiversity, actually, when we think about it. And this is, of course, based on a more academic approach. There are ways that different cultures all over the world view life on Earth and the way that that diversity exists. But what I'm going to share with you is just a basic kind of academic breakdown. And so I'm going to share with you a few images that really help me think about it. So one of the first things we think about with biodiversity is almost always species. Like, how many species are there? Oh, does this region have a lot of different species? And that's a totally valid way to think about the diversity of life on Earth. But it's actually only one component, because in the middle of all of these species interactions, we actually have at the very, bottom of this pyramid and supporting all this diversity are genes. So all those things, all the DNA that makes everything on Earth kind of what it is, those genes themselves can be more or less diverse. So we could easily say that there's a lot of genetic diversity in a certain region, or that within one species it's very biodiverse in terms of the genes. And the reason you see this at the bottom of the pyramid is because the differences in genes are really what allows evolution to happen. It allows response to change. So if something comes through and there's a change to the environment, all of the diversity of those genes and all of those differences in a species and individuals let them adapt and evolve. And so we have genetic diversity, we have species diversity, and then when we tie it all together, we can start thinking about ecosystems, the actual difference in these huge things. Hi, Jane, help me out with ecosystem services, please. Thank you so much. She loves ecosystems. It's one of her favorite topics, clearly. So when we have ecosystems, we're really thinking about all of the life that is within a system and also its habitat and where it lives. So we're considering living and non-living things, though of course in different cultures, something like the soil, the water could be considered living and life. And that's just one of those differences across the globe. But in general, ecosystem, we have everything alive and also just where it lives in its habitat.
You just mentioned habitat. Can you explain habitat for us? Whether you're in an urban area or a rural area, how do we get to understand?
Sure. So I think of habitat as the necessary kind of things and space that an individual living thing might need. And usually the components of habitat are food and water and cover and space. So you can have food and water available, but if it's in a box that's this big, we wouldn't call that box a habitat unless it was something really small living there. But if it was an elephant and you put an elephant's food and water in a box, that box itself doesn't have space, it doesn't have cover, and so not really habitat. So those four components are habitat. Now you'll notice that in that kind of definition, I'm not saying that it has to be away from humans or that it has to be in some, pristine wildlife reserve. Habitat is just where things live and can eat and drink and have cover. And so there are all kinds of habitats, and that includes human ones that other species use all the time, as Jane is right here, and we are sharing our habitat in my room right now. And certainly there might be an ant, right? And all kinds of smaller things as well. So urban habitats are actually something that all kinds of species use, and not just humans.
So we've speaking to a number of scientists about threats to biodiversity, the threat of species loss. What's the main drivers of the current risk?
Sure. And I'll go ahead and move this just so that we have kind of this idea in front of us as we talk about it, the different levels of biodiversity. The main threats to biodiversity right now in the Anthropocene, which anthro meaning man, so this age of humans where our species is really the dominant force shaping so many of these processes. So during the Anthropocene, during right now, the main drivers of loss of biodiversity on all three of these levels we have here are things like habitat loss and fragmentation. So not only losing habitat, but habitat being fragmented. So connectivity is really important, especially for something like genetic diversity, for individuals to be able to move back and forth and reproduce potentially with individuals from a different group or population to keep that diversity going. And so that can be affected a lot by tourism and things like roads and travel. A lot of our infrastructure can fragment habitat. And so it's not just, do we have enough habitat, but it's also, is it connected? Is there connectivity there? And so that's one of the big drivers. In terms of habitat, one of the other drivers of loss is the actual degradation of the habitat, the condition. So you can imagine things like pollution or changing kind of the amounts of nutrients or certain chemicals, or the clarity or cleanliness of something like the water or the soil. And of course, cleanliness is relative. All species need something a little bit different, but pollution is one of those as in terms of habitat degradation. And certainly within tourism and recreation, there's all kinds of ways that we might pollute the habitats that we are visiting. And speaking of visiting, a lot of times with travel, when humans travel, humans bring along non-humans and they might not even know about it. So with cruise ships or sometimes with planes, with shipments of goods, there can be species that get out of their native range because of that travel. And so these are, when they cause problems, referred to as invasive species. But in general, we can just refer to them as non-native species. So they're out of that native range. They've been moved by humans to a place where they are not usually. And that can cause local issues with biodiversity, usually on that species level or ecosystem level sometimes. Another big one is overexploitation. So that just means overhunting or overfishing, so using too much of certain species. And of course, that use is sometimes an actual livelihood. It's not just choice or recreation. It's people need these things to live and to eat and to be happy and healthy. And so within tourism, as you're visiting different places, you might be participating in eating foods and potentially other species that are local there. And we have to make sure that there is sustainability in the, especially within, fisheries and the way that things are caught and the way that things are then marketed. And climate change is the other big one. And of course, there's many ways that tourism and travel and recreation can affect that. And so those are the big kind of 5 threats to biodiversity, at least right now. And in all of our human actions, we contribute to that. And it's kind of a matter of asking ourselves, how much are we contributing? And then how can we roll that back?
Well, we hope during this series to showcase many projects from the travel and tourism sector, also addressing some of these core challenges, really playing a leadership role and want to replicate and scale those best practices out there. So we really appreciate you taking the science of biodiversity and simplifying it for us in 5 minutes. Thank you so much for your time, Brit.
You are so welcome, and thank you so much for talking with me about this really fascinating topic, and something we can all just keep in mind as we go about our days.